It started with a rumor, as most bad ideas do. I was at the cafe down the block, eavesdropping on two women who were whispering over lattes. "I swear, she doesn't even leave the house anymore," one said, gesturing dramatically with her spoon. "Just sits there, all day, staring at that weird clock of hers." "Which one?" the other asked, clearly pretending not to care but leaning forward anyway. "You know, the big one, with all the gears and the Latin words on it. Looks like something out of a haunted mansion." That's when I realized they were talking about Mrs. Vernon, my neighbor. Mrs. Vernon lived in the big gray house at the end of our cul-de-sac, the one with the ivy creeping up the sides and the curtains always drawn. She was a recluse by every definition of the word. The mail carrier said she only came out at night to collect her post, and the neighborhood kids swore they heard strange noises coming from her house, clangs and whirs, like an engine sputtering to life. I'd always thought the stories were exaggerated, but the clock? That was new. The thing about me is, I can't leave well enough alone. If someone's hiding a secret, I have to know what it is. I think it's a defect in my wiring, like how some people can't help but poke a bruise even though it hurts. And Mrs. Vernon? She was the ultimate mystery. So I made a plan. Not a big one, just a casual, "Oh, I happen to be in the neighborhood," kind of visit. I baked cookies, not well, but they looked passable, and headed to her door. The house was even creepier up close. The ivy wasn't just creeping. It was thriving, wrapping around the windows like green veins. The paint was peeling in long, jagged strips, and the door knocker was shaped like a lion's head, snarling at me as I raised my hand to knock. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, and just as I was about to give up, the door creaked open. Mrs. Vernon stood there, staring at me. She was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, maybe, but there was something ageless about her. Her hair was wild, streaked with silver, and her eyes were sharp, like they could slice through excuses. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice low and measured, like she was weighing each word before releasing it. I held up the cookies. "Hi, I'm your neighbor. Thought I'd stop by and say hello. You know, neighborly stuff." She looked at the cookies, then at me, then back at the cookies. For a moment, I thought she was going to slam the door in my face. Instead, she stepped aside. "Fine, come in." The inside of her house was nothing like I expected. I'd pictured dust and cobwebs, maybe a few taxidermy animals glaring from the corners. Instead, it was intricate. Every surface was covered with gears, tools, and strange contraptions I couldn't begin to name. There were blueprints tacked to the walls, all scrawled with equations and diagrams that made my head spin. And in the center of the room stood the clock. It was massive, almost as tall as me, with a face that glowed faintly gold. Its hands didn't move in the usual way. Instead, they seemed to tick forward and backward at random, as though time couldn't quite make up its mind. Latin phrases were etched into its surface, looping around in spirals. Tempus vincit omnia. Time conquers all. "What is that?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away. Mrs. Vernon's lips twitched, almost like she was amused. "That's my work." "Your work? What does it do?" She hesitated. "It measures things. Possibilities. Outcomes. Like a fortune teller?" I joked, but she didn't laugh. "Something like that," she said, her voice soft now. "It shows what could be, what might have been, and sometimes what shouldn't be." There was a weight to her words that made my stomach flip. "And you just sit here, staring at it?" She raised an eyebrow. "Do you always ask so many questions, or am I just special?" I flushed. "Sorry, I heard some stuff, and I guess I was curious." "Curiosity's dangerous," she said, and there was a warning in her tone. But then, to my surprise, she gestured toward the clock. "Want to see?" My instinct screamed no, but my curiosity, it dragged me forward. She fiddled with one of the gears, and the clock face began to shimmer, like sunlight on water. Slowly, an image came into focus. It was me, or someone who looked like me, standing in an office. I was wearing a sharp suit, holding a stack of papers, and laughing with a man I didn't recognize. "That's not me," I said, though my voice wavered. "It is," Mrs. Vernon replied. In another timeline. What do you mean? Another timeline? She adjusted another gear, and the image shifted. Now I was sitting on a beach, older, holding hands with someone whose face I couldn't see. A little boy ran toward me, laughing, and I scooped him up like he was my whole world. That could be you, she said. Could be? Time's not as linear as you think, she explained. Every choice you make splits off into a new path. This clock, it shows the branches, the lives you didn't live, the ones you still might. My mind raced. Can you change them? The paths? Her face darkened. That's the question, isn't it? I barely slept that night. All I could think about were the images I'd seen. The suit, the beach, the possibilities. I started going back to Mrs. Vernon's house, asking more questions, learning about the clock. She tried to warn me, again and again, not to get attached to what it showed. Some things are meant to stay as they are, she said. But how could I listen, knowing what was out there? One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until I saw her leave. She always went for a late-night walk, and I broke into her house. It wasn't hard. The old lock practically fell open. The clock stood there, glowing faintly, as if it had been waiting for me. I turned the gears. The images swirled. I saw versions of myself I'd never dreamed of, an artist, a scientist, a mother, a recluse. Each one felt like a doorway I could step through. And then I saw her, a version of me sitting at the same clock, her face twisted with regret. Her house was dark, her hands shaking as she turned the gears. "Stop," she whispered, and I froze. She looked straight at me, or maybe through me, and said, "You don't understand what you're tampering with. You'll never find peace this way." The clock flickered and went dark. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, as Mrs. Vernon's voice rang out behind me. "I told you not to touch it." I turned to face her, stammering out an apology, but she wasn't angry. She just looked tired. "I thought I could control it too," she said softly. "But it doesn't work like that. You can't live every life. You only get one." I left that night, shaken. I haven't been back since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint whir of gears in my mind and I wonder, did I make the right choice? Or was it already made for me? AITA? It started with an octopus. Or maybe it started with a bet. Either way, by the end of the night, I'd lost 2 friendships and a considerable amount of dignity, and I still wasn't entirely sure how. Jackie and I had been best friends since college. She was the impulsive, shiny one, always coming up with wild ideas that somehow worked out for her. I was the planner, the steady one who made sure the parachute would actually open before she jumped. It worked. We balanced each other. And then there was Ethan, my boyfriend of 2 years and Jackie's favorite target for teasing. He was the dry-witted, quietly sarcastic type, which meant they clashed in a way that wasn't quite hostile but wasn't exactly friendly either. I always played mediator, but I didn't mind. Until last night. We were at a themed dinner party Jackie had dragged us to. "You'll love it," she'd said. "It's one of those immersive pop-up events. Mystery, adventure, the works." I didn't love it. The theme turned out to be some convoluted mix of a treasure hunt and a seafood buffet, complete with bizarre challenges designed to win your meal. Ethan spent the first half hour quietly mocking the concept, while Jackie threw herself into it with her usual enthusiasm. She'd already solved 2 puzzles by the time the main event was announced. The host, a wiry man in a velvet blazer, clapped his hands dramatically and declared, "The ultimate prize of the evening awaits, the Kraken's feast. But only the bravest soul may claim it. Who among you dares?" Ethan leaned over and whispered, "Bet it's just a fancy plate of calamari." Jackie overheard and grinned. "Careful, Ethan. That kind of attitude might get you volunteered." Sure enough, the host gestured toward a covered platter on stage. To win the Kraken's feast, he announced, one must best the Kraken itself in a test of courage. Who will accept the challenge? Jackie raised her hand immediately, but then she glanced at Ethan with a wicked smile. "Actually," she said, "I think my dear friend Ethan here would be perfect." Ethan froze. "What? You've been so critical all night," Jackie said sweetly. "Why not put your money where your mouth is?" Everyone laughed, and before Ethan could protest, the host was beckoning him up to the stage. He shot me a look, half amused, half betrayed, and I shrugged apologetically. It was supposed to be harmless fun. The Kraken, as it turned out, was an actual octopus. A massive one, tentacles draped over the edges of the platter like it had been caught mid-escape. The challenge was to eat a single tentacle, a slimy, raw, gleaming thing, without hesitation or assistance. Ethan stared at it like it might spring to life and wrap itself around his neck. The crowd cheered. Jackie was grinning like a maniac. I tried to catch Ethan's eye, to signal that he didn't have to go through with it, but he was already lifting the tentacle. What happened next is difficult to describe. Ethan bit into the octopus with all the enthusiasm of someone chewing on a rubber boot. The crowd went wild. Jackie was doubled over with laughter. And me? I should have been laughing too. But something about the scene rubbed me the wrong way. The way Jackie egged him on. The way Ethan glared at her as he chewed like he was enduring a medieval torture device. When he finally swallowed, his face was a mix of disgust and triumph, and the host declared him the winner. Back at our table, Ethan dropped into his chair and grabbed his water glass like it was a lifeline. That, he said, was the worst experience of my life. Jackie snorted. Oh, come on. You're a hero now. The Kraken's conqueror. Ethan gave her a flat look. You only volunteered me because you wanted to watch me suffer. Jackie feigned innocence. What? No. I just thought it would be funny. Exactly, Ethan said. You thought it would be funny. At my expense. I tried to defuse the tension. Okay, let's all take a breath. It's over now. Let's just enjoy the rest of the night. But Ethan wasn't letting it go. This is what you do, Jackie. You turn everything into some kind of joke. You don't care who it embarrasses as long as you get a laugh. Jackie's smile faded. Whoa, where's this coming from? It was one stupid challenge. You're fine. That's not the point, Ethan snapped. You always do this. You make me feel like a punching bag. Jackie's eyes narrowed. Maybe if you weren't so uptight all the time, it wouldn't bother you. Guys, I said, trying to interrupt, but they were locked in now, voices rising. Uptight, Ethan said. At least I don't act like the world revolves around me and my bad ideas. Oh, please, Jackie said, rolling her eyes. You're just mad because I can have fun without worrying what everyone thinks of me. Unlike you. Fun? Ethan said, his tone icy. You mean dragging other people down so you can feel better about yourself? That's enough, I said sharply, but it was too late. Jackie turned to me, her face red with anger. Are you just going to sit there and let him talk to me like that? I hesitated. I think maybe Ethan has a point. Jackie's eyes widened in disbelief. Seriously? You're taking his side? I'm not taking sides, I said quickly. I just think, sometimes your jokes go too far. Oh, so now I'm the bad guy? Jackie said. For trying to make the night fun? Unbelievable. Ethan scoffed. Yeah, real fun. Watching someone choke down raw octopus. Stop it. I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. They both stared at me, and for a moment, the whole table was silent. I can't do this, Jackie said finally, grabbing her bag. Call me when you're done playing referee. She stormed out. Ethan didn't say a word. He just finished his drink, his jaw tight, and then muttered, I'm going home. And just like that, I was alone, sitting in the wreckage of a night that was supposed to be harmless fun. I stared at the Kraken's feast trophy on the table, a ridiculous little figurine of a tentacled monster holding a fork, and wondered if I'd made the right choice. If there even was a right choice. AITA? The first time I heard the melody, it came from the walls of my apartment, faint as a whisper. At first, I thought it was the pipes or the wind, some mundane explanation for the haunting tune that seemed to drift just beyond my reach. But the longer I listened, the more I realized how impossibly intricate it was. The notes bent and shimmered like light on water, unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. I followed it through my tiny living room, past the peeling wallpaper and the stack of unopened bills on the counter, to the wall by the window where it seemed to resonate the loudest. There was no source, no radio, no hidden speaker, just music, vibrating faintly against the plaster. I brushed it off as an overworked imagination and too many nights spent alone. But the melody lingered, slipping into my dreams. In those dreams, the music wasn't confined to the walls. It filled the air, alive and glowing, threading through a vast, shifting city that seemed both ancient and impossibly futuristic. The streets twisted in impossible angles, lined with towers of glass and bone, and people, if they could be called that, moved like shadow puppets, their faces obscured by veils of shimmering fabric. Always, at the center of the city, was a great door, carved from a single slab of black stone, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed in time with the melody. I would wake up gasping, the tune ringing in my ears. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I began to investigate. My landlord, a grizzled man who smelled of turpentine and cheap cigars, claimed the building was just old, the walls full of creaks and groans. "It's probably rats," he said, scratching his beard. "You live in a place like this long enough, you get used to the noise." But this wasn't noise. It was a song, growing more insistent by the day. I took to recording it, placing my phone against the wall where the melody was strongest. The recordings were faint, barely audible even at full volume, but when I ran them through audio software, strange patterns emerged, frequencies that seemed almost mathematical, like a code. I didn't know what they meant, but the discovery fueled an obsession I couldn't explain. I stopped answering calls, ignored my job, barely left the apartment. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with anticipation, as though something was waiting for me to act. Then, one evening, as I sat staring at the waveforms on my laptop, the melody changed. It was subtle at first, a missing note here, a shift in tempo there, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I moved to the wall, pressing my ear against it, and for the first time, the music seemed to respond to me, swelling in volume as if acknowledging my presence. I reached out, running my fingers along the plaster, and felt a faint vibration, like the purring of a distant engine. Without thinking, I knocked. 3 sharp taps. The music stopped. The silence was suffocating, heavier than any sound. I held my breath, half expecting the landlord's voice from below, yelling at me to keep it down. Instead, there was a single, answering knock from the other side. My heart thundered in my chest as I stepped back, staring at the blank wall. It was solid, unbroken, but now I was sure something or someone was there. The knocking became a pattern, a series of beats that matched the rhythm of the melody. I grabbed a pencil and scribbled it down, line after line of seemingly nonsensical dots and dashes. It wasn't until I saw the whole sequence that I realized what it was. Morse code. Simple, ancient, and undeniable. "Help me." I froze, my mind racing. Help who? From where? My instinct was to call the police, but what would I tell them? That my apartment was haunted by musical walls sending cryptic messages? Instead, I knocked back. "Who are you?" The reply came almost instantly, a rapid series of taps I struggled to keep up with. I translated it slowly, my pulse quickening with every letter. Trapped. Open door. What door? There was no door in my apartment other than the one that led to the hallway. I searched the walls frantically, running my hands along the edges, pressing against the corners, until I found it. A faint outline, almost invisible beneath the wallpaper, the edges worn smooth by time. The melody began again, louder now, as if urging me on. I tore at the paper, nails scraping against the plaster until the outline became clearer. A small, square panel, no larger than a drawer. Behind it was a keyhole. The music swelled, filling the room with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. I had no key, but I had a crowbar from a failed attempt to assemble a bookshelf. With trembling hands, I wedged it into the gap and pried. The panel gave way with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow passage that reeked of damp earth and rust. The melody was deafening now, pouring from the opening like a living thing. I hesitated for only a moment before climbing through. The passage was impossibly long, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were slick with moisture, and the ground beneath my feet felt uneven, as though paved with broken tiles. The music guided me, pulling me forward, until I emerged into a vast chamber bathed in a dim, pulsating light. At the center of the chamber stood a door. It was the same one from my dreams, black stone, etched with glowing symbols. The air vibrated with its power, the melody now a physical force that thrummed in my chest. I approached cautiously, my hand outstretched, and the symbols flared brighter as if recognizing me. "Open it," the melody seemed to say. "Set it free." I pressed my palm against the stone. The symbols burned hot under my touch, and with a grinding sound that echoed through the chamber, the door began to open. A rush of cold wind enveloped me, and the music stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice, deep, resonant, and ancient. "You have freed me," it said. Before I could respond, the chamber dissolved into blinding light. When I awoke, I was back in my apartment, the wall intact, the melody gone. For days, I heard nothing, the silence almost worse than the song. Then, the world began to change. Clocks ran backward. Shadows moved without their owners. People spoke of strange dreams they couldn't explain, of a city they'd never visited, of a black door. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I hear it again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The melody. The night my neighbor's dog barked for the first time in 6 years, I knew something was wrong. He was a quiet, lumbering Labrador named Benny, a permanent fixture behind the chain-link fence between my yard and Mr. Farrow's house. Benny wasn't the kind of dog to make a fuss, but that night, his barking was frantic, like he was trying to sound an alarm. I stepped outside, the chill of the autumn air biting through my sweater. Benny's bark grew louder as I approached the fence, and when he saw me, he ran to the edge of his yard, wagging his tail in wild circles, then back to the side door of Mr. Farrow's house, as if to say, "Follow me." Mr. Farrow had always been a mystery. He moved into the neighborhood a decade ago, kept mostly to himself, and didn't seem to have any family or friends. I tried to strike up conversations over the years, inviting him to block parties, offering to help with his yard, but he was polite and distant, the kind of person who could smile and deflect without ever letting you in. The only real connection we had was Benny, who I sometimes slipped treats through the fence. As I stood there watching Benny, a strange sense of urgency settled over me. The house was dark, no lights in any windows, and the air seemed unnaturally still. I called out, "Mr. Farrow? Is everything okay?" My voice felt too loud in the quiet. Benny barked again, insistent. Something wasn't right. I hesitated for a moment, then climbed over the fence. Benny met me halfway, his tail wagging but his eyes darting nervously toward the house. I followed him to the side door, which was slightly ajar. That set off alarm bells in my head. Mr. Farrow was meticulous, the kind of person who locked every door and window before going to bed. I knocked softly, pushing the door open a bit more. "Mr. Farrow? It's me, your neighbor, Laura. Benny's been barking, and I just wanted to check." No response. Just the creak of the door swinging wider. Benny darted inside, and I followed, my heart pounding. The kitchen was spotless, as usual, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a catalog. But something felt off, too much silence, a faint metallic tang in the air. I moved cautiously through the house, calling out his name. It wasn't until I reached the living room that I saw him. Mr. Farrow was slumped in his armchair, his head tilted to one side, his face pale and still. For one terrifying moment, I thought he was dead, but as I rushed closer, I saw the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was alive, but barely. His skin was clammy, his lips dry and cracked, and a small puddle of spilled water glistened on the floor beside him. On the coffee table in front of him, there was a note. I reached for it with trembling hands. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably his. "To whomever finds me, please forgive me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My brain scrambled to process what I was seeing. Suicide? No, there were no pills, no weapon, nothing to suggest he'd tried to harm himself. But the note was a goodbye, and it chilled me to the core. I fumbled for my phone and called 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. The operator assured me help was on the way, but the minutes stretched like hours as I sat there, unsure of what to do. Benny curled up at my feet, his big brown eyes full of worry. I stroked his head absent-mindedly, my mind racing. Why had Mr. Farrow written that note? What had pushed him to this point? And why had he left the door open? Almost as if he wanted someone to find him. The paramedics arrived quickly, their flashing lights painting the quiet street in bursts of red and blue. They worked efficiently, checking his vitals, loading him onto a stretcher, and asking me questions I couldn't fully answer. I told them about the note, about Benny's barking, about how something had just felt wrong. They nodded, their faces professionally blank, and took him away. I was left standing in the living room, feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's life. Benny nudged my leg, and I realized I couldn't leave him there alone. I took him back to my house, promising myself I'd figure out what to do with him later. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of Mr. Farrow's slumped figure or the note on the coffee table. I called the hospital, posing as a concerned friend. They wouldn't tell me much, but they said he was stable and under observation. That should have been a relief, but it only deepened the mystery. The following day, I decided to visit him. It felt intrusive, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he needed someone, even if he didn't think so. When I arrived, he was sitting up in bed, looking frail but alert. His eyes widened slightly when he saw me, a flicker of surprise breaking through his usual guarded expression. "Laura," he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "Benny," I blurted out, as if that explained everything. He was barking, and your door was open, and look, I'm sorry if I overstepped, but I couldn't just ignore it." He sighed, sinking back against the pillows. "I suppose I should thank you." "You don't have to," I said quickly. "But I read the note. I don't mean to pry, but what's going on? Why did you write that?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, like he was unspooling a story he'd kept hidden for years. "I've been sick for a while. Heart failure. The doctors gave me options, medications, maybe surgery, but I couldn't see the point. No family, no close friends. Just Benny. And I thought, maybe it was time to stop fighting." My throat tightened. "You have Benny. And well, you have me. I mean, I'm not much, but I live next door and He held up a hand, stopping me. "You've done enough. More than I deserve." "That's not true," I said firmly. "You don't have to go through this alone. Let people help you." He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe." I left the hospital feeling a strange mix of hope and sadness. Over the next few weeks, I visited him regularly, bringing books, small gifts, and updates on Benny, who had become a permanent fixture in my life. Slowly, Mr. Farrow began to open up, not much, but enough to let me glimpse the person beneath the quiet exterior. He didn't recover completely. His illness was too advanced for that. But he started treatments, and he let me and Benny be his support system. And in doing so, he gave me something I hadn't realized I needed. A sense of connection, of purpose. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if Benny had sensed it all along. If he knew his frantic barking that night would bring me to his owner in time. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was something more. Either way, I'm glad I listened. AITA for pushing my way into Mr. Farrow's life? Or did Benny and I do the right thing? I always thought my life was quiet by design. I liked it that way. I had my tiny apartment, my cactus collection, and my job at the used bookstore. Nothing ever tilted too far out of place. So when Evan, my second cousin, barely a branch on my family tree, texted me out of nowhere, asking if he could stay with me for a bit, I wasn't thrilled, but I wasn't about to say no. He'd been through a rough patch, lost his job, gotten divorced, and according to his text, needed a fresh start. I figured it would be a week or two, tops. How bad could it be? He arrived 3 days later with a single suitcase, a skateboard, and a drone. I should have known. Evan had always been the oddball at family gatherings, showing up in vintage tuxedos or wearing neon sunglasses indoors. I didn't realize oddball had morphed into full-blown chaos. The moment he stepped into my apartment, he made himself at home. Literally. Within hours, he moved my couch 3 feet to the left because he said it blocked his creative energy, stacked my cactus pots into what he called a succulent skyline, and somehow convinced me to let him use the bookshelf as a charging station for his drone. I let it slide. He was family, after all. The first few days were interesting. Evan was the type of person who woke up at noon but stayed awake until 3 a.m. He turned the kitchen into his personal science lab, experimenting with combinations like banana slices dipped in sriracha or something he called coffee foam clouds, which left my microwave splattered with egg whites. Every time I raised an eyebrow, he'd grin and say, "You'll thank me when this is trending on TikTok." I did not thank him. He wasn't entirely useless, though. He claimed he was job hunting, which involved him hunched over his laptop, surrounded by half-empty cans of kombucha, muttering things like, "What if I invented a new job?" He also offered to help around the apartment, which meant rearranging my kitchen drawers by frequency of use and accidentally shattering my favorite coffee mug because it was begging to be free. I tried to be patient. He was going through a rough time. But patience only goes so far when you come home to find your bathtub filled with fish. Goldfish. At least 20 of them, lazily swimming in 2 inches of water. Evan greeted me with a proud smile, holding a bag of fish food. "I saved them," he said. "They were gonna get flushed at that sketchy pet store down the block. You brought them here? To my bathtub?" My voice was high-pitched, bordering on hysterical. "They're temporary residents," he assured me. Like me. That was the first time I seriously considered telling Evan he had to leave. But the way he spoke about the fish, like he'd single-handedly liberated them from certain doom, made me hesitate. I didn't have the heart to tell him to get rid of them. Instead, I spent the next 2 weeks showering at the gym while Evan tried, and failed, to find someone willing to adopt 20 goldfish. The pet store refused to take them back. "They're not refugees," the owner told him. "They're fish." By the 3rd week, things spiraled further. Evan decided he wanted to be a filmmaker. He turned my living room into a makeshift studio, complete with tripods, LED lights, and a green screen duct taped to the wall. His masterpiece? A series of short films starring the goldfish, which he'd named after famous philosophers. He spent hours narrating their imaginary debates. "Nietzsche has serious beef with Aristotle," he explained to me one night, holding a microphone over the bathtub. "It's gonna blow people's minds." It wasn't just the goldfish. Evan had a knack for attracting chaos wherever he went. One day, he borrowed my bike without asking and somehow came back with a stray dog. "He followed me home," he said, as if that explained why there was now a scruffy mutt sniffing my laundry. I asked him to take it to a shelter, but he insisted the dog had a vibe and that we were destined to be his guardians. I wasn't sure who the "we" in this scenario was, but I ended up naming the dog Murphy because Evan was too busy editing his philosophical fish film to bother. I finally snapped the night I came home to find Evan hosting an impromptu film screening. My apartment was packed with people I'd never met, all of them sipping kombucha out of my cereal bowls and applauding as Evan projected his fish film onto the living room wall. Murphy barked every time the audience clapped. I pulled Evan aside, trying to stay calm. "This has to stop," I said. "You can't just do whatever you want here. This is my home." He blinked at me like I was the unreasonable one. "Ellie, you've been living in a box. I'm trying to help you break free." "I don't need to break free," I said through gritted teeth. "I need to be able to come home without finding fish philosophers in my bathtub." Evan sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed guru. "I thought you'd understand. I thought we were family." I stared at him, my frustration boiling over. Family doesn't mean turning my life upside down for you. Whatever this is. You've been here for 3 weeks, Evan. You need to figure out what's next. He was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine. I'll leave tomorrow. But don't be surprised if you miss this. People like you always miss the chaos once it's gone." The next morning, Evan packed up his suitcase, his skateboard, and the remaining fish, somehow. A few had disappeared. He left a note on my kitchen counter. "Ellie, don't let the world shrink you. Also, don't forget to feed Murphy." Now, weeks later, my apartment is back to normal. The couch is where it belongs. The bathtub is fish-free, and Murphy is snoring on the rug. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Evan and his bizarre world of goldfish debates and kombucha-fueled dreams. And I wonder, Did I overreact? Was I too rigid, too unwilling to embrace the chaos? Or was Evan just a tornado dressed up as a second cousin, leaving destruction wherever he landed? AITA? I first noticed the fox when I came home late from my shift at the hospital. It was sitting at the edge of the garden, barely more than a shadow in the moonlight, its sharp eyes fixed on me as I stepped out of my car. Something about it struck me as strange. Not the fact that it was there, but the stillness of it. Foxes are supposed to dart away, quick and skittish, but this one stayed. It watched me, unblinking, as if it was waiting for something. The next morning, I told my brother Marcus about it over coffee. He lives with me these days, ever since his divorce left him without a place to land. "A fox?" he asked, sounding more amused than concerned. "You're probably just tired. Could have been a stray cat or something." "I know what I saw," I said, annoyed. Marcus has always been like that, brushing off things that don't fit neatly into his worldview. "It was a fox, and it didn't run. It just stared." "Maybe it was sizing you up for dinner," he joked, biting into a piece of toast. That evening, the fox was back. Same spot, just beyond the edge of the garden, half hidden by the shadows of the tall oaks. This time, I stood at the window, watching it as it watched me. After a few minutes, it tilted its head, almost imperceptibly, and disappeared into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wanted something from me. The third night, it didn't just watch. It brought something, a small bird, limp and broken. Its feathers scattered across the grass like pieces of ash. The fox nudged it closer to the house, its movements slow and deliberate, before retreating to its usual spot. I stepped outside, unsure why I felt compelled to approach it. The bird was cold, long gone, and the fox's eyes seemed to ask a question I couldn't understand. When I stepped closer, it didn't move. Marcus thought I was losing it when I told him. "It left you a gift? You're reading way too much into this. It's probably just some weird scavenger thing." "It's not random," I argued, pacing the kitchen. "It feels intentional, like it's trying to tell me something." He shook his head and muttered something about overworking myself, but I couldn't let it go. The fox kept coming every night without fail, and every time it brought something new. A half-eaten apple, a torn scrap of fabric, once a single white feather, pristine and unblemished. Each time, it left the item at the edge of the garden, watching as I approached, and then disappearing into the woods when I got too close. I started leaving things for it in return. At first, it was small offerings, bits of food, scraps of cloth. The fox would approach cautiously, sniffing at the items before taking them. It never stayed long, but I could feel the tension between us easing, as if we were building some strange, unspoken trust. Then, one night, it didn't come alone. Behind it, limping and fragile, was another fox, its fur matted and its body trembling with exhaustion. I realized, with a jolt of clarity, that this was what the gifts had been about. The fox wasn't just asking for help. It was preparing me for this moment. The injured fox collapsed near the edge of the garden, and I didn't hesitate. Marcus tried to stop me when I grabbed an old blanket and a first aid kit, muttering about rabies and wildlife laws, but I ignored him. I approached slowly, crouching low to avoid spooking them. The healthy fox backed away, watching as I wrapped the injured one in the blanket and carried it inside. Marcus was furious. "You can't just bring a wild animal into the house, Alex. Are you out of your mind? Look at it," I snapped, my voice trembling. "It's dying, Marcus. What am I supposed to do? Just leave it out there?" I spent hours that night tending to the fox. It had a deep gash along its side, likely from a fight or a trap, and it was severely dehydrated. I cleaned the wound, bandaged it, and set up a makeshift bed in the laundry room. The healthy fox stayed just outside the door, pacing nervously, but it didn't try to come in. Over the next few days, the injured fox started to recover. It ate the food I left for it and tolerated my presence, though it never let me get too close. Marcus kept his distance, muttering about the whole situation under his breath, but not doing much to stop me. And then, one night, the healthy fox was gone. I found its usual spot empty, the grass pressed flat where it used to sit. I felt an inexplicable sense of loss, as if something vital had been taken from me. But the next morning, it returned, with something I could only describe as impossible. In its jaws was an old leather pouch, worn and cracked with age. The fox dropped it at my feet, its eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Inside the pouch was a key, simple and rusted, along with a slip of paper folded so many times it was barely holding together. The writing on it was faint, almost illegible, but I managed to make out the words, "Where it began." I didn't understand at first, but the fox wouldn't let it go. It stayed close, urging me toward the woods with soft yips and the occasional tug at my sleeve. I don't know why I followed, but I did. Marcus refused to come, shaking his head and calling me crazy as I disappeared into the trees with the fox at my side. We walked for hours, deeper into the woods than I'd ever been. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting like skeletal hands, and the air grew colder, heavier. Eventually, we came to a small clearing where a dilapidated cabin stood, half swallowed by the earth. The fox stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching as I approached the cabin with the key clutched tightly in my hand. The lock on the door was rusted, the metal so corroded I thought it might snap when I turned the key. But it gave way with a groan, and the door creaked open to reveal a space that felt more like a memory than a room. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by shafts of pale light from the cracked ceiling. On the table in the center of the room was a photograph in a broken frame. It was of me, or rather, of a child who looked just like me, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize, but whose face stirred something deep and aching in my chest. Beneath the photo was a note in the same handwriting as the one from the pouch. "You promised." I don't remember leaving the cabin. I don't remember the walk back, or how I ended up sitting on the edge of the garden with the fox at my side. All I know is that when I turned to look at it, the fox was gone, and I was left holding the photograph, the weight of its message pressing down on me like the earth itself. Marcus found me hours later, still sitting there, unable to explain what I'd found or what it meant. All I could do was ask the question that had been clawing at my mind since the moment I opened that door. AITA? It was supposed to be the night everything changed for me. For years, I'd been working on a concept that blended my love of technology with my obsession with storytelling. An interactive art installation I called Threads of Memory. It was a web of glowing threads suspended in midair, each one reactive to touch, with whispered voices that told fragments of a narrative when pulled. The threads lit up in patterns, weaving an evolving story based on how participants interacted with them. It was a bold, ambitious project, and tonight was the opening night. My opening night. The gallery was buzzing. I'd spent weeks preparing, making sure the installation worked flawlessly, rehearsing my little speech about memory, interconnection, and the fragility of storytelling. The turnout was better than I expected. Friends, family, art enthusiasts, even a local journalist I'd begged to come. Everything was perfect. And then Ellie showed up. Ellie wasn't just my best friend. She was practically a co-conspirator in my life. We'd met during college orientation when we both skipped the icebreaker games to sneak off and drink contraband beer in a stairwell. Since then, she'd been my partner in crime, my sounding board, and sometimes my harshest critic. But Ellie had a knack for making things hers. A casual housewarming party would somehow morph into Ellie's stand-up comedy hour. A group trip would turn into Ellie's personal photo shoot. She didn't do it maliciously. She was just magnetic, impossible to ignore. Ellie walked in late, of course, wearing this dazzling green jumpsuit that practically demanded attention. Heads turned. People murmured. She gave a little wave, like royalty, and I immediately felt the faint sting of annoyance. She breezed over to me, arms outstretched. "Darling, this is incredible," she said, enveloping me in a hug. Her perfume was expensive and overwhelming. "Thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been working on it forever." "And it shows," she said, gesturing toward the glowing threads. "It's so you. Thoughtful, intricate, a little chaotic. I love it." I smiled, though her tone made my stomach tighten. "Thanks. I'm glad you're here. I wouldn't miss it for the world," she said, grinning. For a while, things were fine. Ellie mingled, charming everyone in her orbit while I stayed near the installation, guiding people through it and answering questions. The threads reacted beautifully, glowing and humming as people tugged and explored. I overheard snippets of conversation, praise for the concept, curiosity about the technology, someone even comparing it to a piece by Olafur Eliasson. And then Ellie clinked her wine glass. "Excuse me, everyone," she called out, her voice ringing through the gallery. The chatter died down as people turned toward her. My heart sank. "I just want to say," Ellie began, holding her glass aloft, "how proud I am of my dear friend here. This installation is nothing short of genius. Let's all give her a round of applause, shall we?" The crowd erupted in applause. I smiled tightly, nodding in acknowledgement, but Ellie wasn't done. And, since we're all here in this gorgeous space, I figured it's the perfect time to share some news of my own. My stomach churned. "I've been working on something too," Ellie continued, her smile radiant. "And I just signed a deal with a production company to turn my screenplay into a feature film." The room broke into gasps and cheers. People flocked to her, congratulating her, asking questions, showering her with admiration. I stood there, frozen, watching as Ellie's news swallowed my night whole. The glowing threads of memory flickered behind her, now little more than a backdrop for Ellie's triumph. My mom approached me, placing a hand on my arm. "Isn't that exciting?" she said, her voice warm but oblivious. "Thrilling," I said, my voice flat. The evening spiraled. People who'd been marveling at my installation were now clustered around Ellie, hanging on her every word as she described her screenplay. Darkly comedic, postmodern take on relationships, whatever that meant. The journalist who'd come to write about threads of memory had his notebook out, scribbling down Ellie's quotes. I tried to salvage the night, guiding a few stragglers through the installation, but even they seemed distracted, their eyes darting toward the Ellie-centric commotion. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Ellie," I said loudly, stepping into the circle of admirers. She turned to me, beaming. "Yes, darling?" "This is incredible news," I said, forcing a smile. "But maybe tonight isn't the best time for it?" The room went quiet. Ellie's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "This was supposed to be about threads of memory, about my work. I've spent years on this, Ellie. Years. And now it feels like, I don't know, like my opening night is just an afterthought." Ellie's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing. "I wasn't trying to overshadow anything," she said. "I was just excited to share." "Couldn't you have waited?" I interrupted, my voice trembling. "Just one night? Was that too much to ask?" The silence was suffocating. People exchanged awkward glances, some quietly slipping away toward the wine table. "I didn't realize you'd be so territorial," Ellie said finally, her voice icy. "I thought you'd be happy for me." "I am happy for you," I said, the words catching in my throat. "But this isn't about happiness, Ellie. It's about respect. You've always had to be the center of attention, and I've always let you. But not tonight. Not here." Ellie stared at me, her face unreadable. Then she set her wine glass down with deliberate precision. "Well," she said, her voice clipped, "I'm sorry if I stole your spotlight. That was never my intention." She grabbed her clutch and walked out, her heels clicking against the gallery floor. The rest of the night was a blur. A few kind souls stayed, murmuring reassurances and half-heartedly engaging with the installation, but the magic was gone. I went home feeling hollow, replaying the confrontation in my head. Now I can't stop wondering, was I wrong? Should I have just smiled and let Ellie have her moment, even if it meant losing mine? Or was I right to call her out, to finally stand up for myself after years of playing second fiddle? AITA? The little cafe on the corner of Rivermont Street was never supposed to exist. There wasn't even a record of it on city maps, which was strange given that it had a website, a phone number, and, more bafflingly, a perfect 5-star review score. It just appeared one day, nestled between a pawn shop and a florist, its weathered wooden sign creaking in the breeze. It was called the Inkwell. I found it by accident. My phone had died on the way to a job interview, leaving me hopelessly lost in a part of town I didn't recognize. The sight of the cafe's warm, glowing windows was like a beacon in the dreary drizzle of the afternoon. The name above the door felt oddly familiar, though I couldn't place why. When I stepped inside, the scent of coffee and old books enveloped me. It wasn't like other cafes. This one was quiet, almost reverent, as though even sound itself was reluctant to intrude. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with books but with odd trinkets. A clock with no hands, a jar of marbles, a pair of gloves too large for any human hand. The tables were mismatched, some with intricate carvings, others plain and scratched, and the chairs didn't seem to match them either. The barista behind the counter looked up as I entered, her dark hair pinned back with what appeared to be quill pins. Her eyes were deep, unplaceable shades of gray, and she smiled at me like she knew a secret I didn't. "First time?" she asked. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Take a seat," she said, gesturing to a table near the window. "I'll bring you something." I wanted to protest, to ask for a menu, but something about her tone made it impossible. I sat down, my hands resting on the worn wood of the table. When she returned, she set down a steaming cup in front of me. It wasn't coffee or tea. The liquid inside was dark and viscous, swirling with faint traces of gold. "Drink," she said simply. "What is it?" I asked, eyeing the cup suspiciously. "Your story," she replied. I laughed nervously. "My story?" She nodded, her smile unwavering. "Everyone who comes here drinks their story. Some people find what they've lost. Others learn what they've forgotten. But everyone drinks." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the cup. I should have left. Everything about the situation screamed that it wasn't normal, wasn't safe. But the liquid in the cup shimmered, and something about it pulled at me, like a thread unraveling in my chest. Before I knew it, I'd lifted it to my lips and taken a sip. The world around me shifted. I wasn't in the cafe anymore. I was standing in the living room of a house I hadn't seen in years. My childhood home. The air smelled of lavender and dust, just as it had when I was a kid. And there, in the corner, was my mother, sitting in her favorite chair, knitting. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked up, her face lighting with a smile I hadn't seen since the day she died. "There you are," she said, as though she'd been waiting for me. I wanted to run to her, to hug her, but my feet wouldn't move. The scene around me rippled like water, and suddenly I was in a different place. My old college dorm room, surrounded by textbooks and empty coffee cups. My best friend, Liv, was sitting on the bed, laughing at something on her phone. Liv, who I hadn't spoken to in years, who had disappeared one day without explanation. "Liv," I called, reaching for her. But the scene shifted again, faster this time. Memories flickered around me like a film reel on fast forward. My first apartment, the day I lost my job, the night I'd stood on a bridge and stared at the black water below, wondering if it would swallow me whole. And then I was back in the cafe, gasping for air, the cup still clutched in my hands. The barista was watching me, her expression unreadable. What just happened?" I managed to choke out. "You drank," she said simply. "The rest is up to you." I looked down at the cup. It was empty now, the shimmering liquid gone. But on the bottom of the cup, etched into the ceramic, was a single word: return. "What does it mean?" I asked, holding it up. The barista tilted her head, her eyes glinting. "That's for you to figure out." I left the inkwell in a daze, the word return burning in my mind. I didn't notice until I got home that the cafe wasn't listed on any map, that its website had disappeared, and that the street where it had stood was now empty, the pawn shop and florist pressed together as though there had never been a space between them. But I knew it had been real. And when my phone buzzed later that night with a text from Liv, the first in years, I knew I wasn't imagining things. "Hey," it said, "I think we need to talk." Somewhere, the thread of my story was being woven back together. I always knew there was something strange about my family, but I didn't put the pieces together until the night of my cousin Sam's induction ceremony. Everyone made a big deal about it, like they always did when one of us hit what they called the threshold. It was a family tradition, they said, something that set us apart. And sure, I'd seen these ceremonies before, but it wasn't until Sam's that I realized what was really going on. The evening began with the usual dinner at my aunt's house. Sam, who just turned 25, looked nervous but proud. wearing the suit his dad bought him for the occasion. Everyone else was buzzing around him like he was some kind of king. My mom kept saying, "Oh, I can't wait to see what he chooses," and Sam would nod solemnly like he was about to accept some mystical burden. I asked what she meant, but she just smiled and said, "You'll understand when it's your time." The induction itself was held in the basement. That's where it always happened, but until that night, I'd never been allowed to watch. Only those who've crossed the threshold can attend, my uncle used to say. Tonight, though, they finally let me in because I was old enough to learn. The basement didn't look like I remembered. As a kid, it had been a place for storage and the occasional dart game. Now, it was transformed. Candles lined the walls, and in the center of the room was an ornate pedestal holding a single glass jar. The jar was filled with something dark, shifting like smoke caught in a bottle. The air felt thick and heavy, like it carried secrets. Uncle Paul stood by the pedestal, holding an old leather-bound book. Sam was ushered to the front, while the rest of us gathered in a circle. I tried to catch his eye, but he didn't look back. Uncle Paul opened the book and began to read in a language I didn't recognize. His voice was deep and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The smoke in the jar started to swirl faster. I leaned toward my mom and whispered, "What is this?" "Shh," she said, her eyes fixed on the jar. "Just watch." Uncle Paul finished his chant, and the room seemed to exhale. He turned to Sam. "It's time. Choose." Sam stepped forward, his hands trembling. He reached for the jar, and as his fingers brushed the glass, the smoke surged upward, forming into a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. The figure loomed over Sam, whispering words I couldn't hear. Sam nodded once, then twice, and finally said, "I accept." The figure dissolved into smoke again and poured itself into Sam's chest. He staggered but didn't fall. When he stood upright, his eyes glowed faintly for a moment before fading back to normal. Everyone erupted into applause. "What just happened?" I asked, louder this time. My mom gave me a pitying look. "That's the choice. When you reach the threshold, you inherit the family's legacy." "What legacy?" "Power," she said simply. "Responsibility. It's why our family is special." Special was not the word I would have used. Creepy? Cult-like? Maybe. But as the ceremony ended and people started congratulating Sam, I couldn't stop staring at him. He looked the same, but there was something different about the way he carried himself. He was calmer, surer, like he'd been handed a cheat code for life. Over the next few weeks, I saw the change in action. Sam, who'd always been shy and awkward, suddenly had a magnetic presence. People listened to him when he spoke, even our overbearing grandfather. At work, he got promoted within days of the ceremony. It was as if the universe had decided to smooth his path. Meanwhile, I was slogging through my third rejection letter for a job I was overqualified for. At the next family gathering, I couldn't keep my frustration bottled up. "So, what, this threshold thing just magically makes life easier?" Sam gave me a knowing smile. "It's not magic. It's alignment. Once you accept the legacy, everything just fits." "That's a nice way of saying you're handed a shortcut," I snapped. He frowned. "It's not a shortcut. There's a price." "Oh, sure. What's the price? Being perfect at everything?" He didn't answer, but the room grew quiet. My mom placed a hand on my shoulder. "You'll understand when it's your time." That phrase again, like a door I wasn't allowed to open yet. I hated it. When my 25th birthday rolled around, the invitations went out, the candles were lit, and the jar reappeared. I was nervous, but also skeptical. What if this was just some elaborate family placebo? A trick to make us believe we were special so we acted like it? I descended into the basement, the air heavy with anticipation. Uncle Paul opened the book, chanted the words, and the smoke began its dance. This time, it felt like the room was watching me, waiting to see if I'd measure up. When he finished, Uncle Paul turned to me. "It's time. Choose." I stepped forward, my heart hammering. The jar pulsed like it was alive, and the shadow inside formed its figure, towering over me. The glowing eyes pierced through my thoughts, and a voice, ancient and layered, whispered directly into my mind. "Do you accept the legacy?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. My instinct screamed at me to run, but something deeper, something primal, held me in place. What happens if I don't? The figure tilted its head. Then you remain as you are, unseen, unremarkable. And if I say yes? The figure's eyes burned brighter. You gain what your family has carried for generations: strength, influence, and the weight of their choices. I hesitated, my gaze flicking to my mom and uncle. They were watching with a mix of pride and anxiety. Sam, standing in the corner, gave me a small nod. I accept, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow surged into me, cold and suffocating. For a moment, it felt like I was being torn apart. Every regret, every failure, every buried fear dragged into the light. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. I stood there, gasping, my heart racing. Everyone clapped and cheered, but I felt off, like a door had been opened in my mind, and I couldn't shut it. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. People listened to me more. Opportunities seemed to fall into my lap. But there were darker things, too. Dreams I couldn't shake. A voice that sometimes whispered, reminding me of what I'd agreed to. One night, unable to sleep, I called Sam. "What's the price?" I asked, my voice trembling. He was silent for a long time before he finally said, "You'll find out." And now, I'm left wondering if I made the right choice. The house on Fleet Street had been boarded up for years. Everyone knew it. Everyone avoided it. It wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. No ghostly wails, no eerie figures in windows. But there was something about it that made people cross to the other side of the road. Except me. I didn't just walk past it. I went in. It started on a bet, the kind of stupid thing teenagers do when they're bored and trying to prove they're tougher than they feel. My friends dared me to spend an hour inside, promising me $20 and bragging rights if I made it. What they didn't know was that I'd been planning to go in for months. Not because I wasn't scared, I was, but because I'd seen the light. It wasn't constant, the light. It came and went, a faint golden glow that seeped out from the cracks in the boarded-up windows, always at odd hours. 2:12 a.m. for 47 p.m., times that didn't make sense. No one else seemed to notice it, or if they did, they ignored it. But it called to me, like a song I couldn't quite hear but couldn't stop humming. The front door was stuck, swollen with years of rain and neglect, but a good shove got it open. Dust motes danced in the faint light from the street outside. The air was thick, stale, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The silence was immediate and complete, as if the house had swallowed the sound of the outside world. The first floor was unremarkable. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, a staircase that sagged ominously. It was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned house. But the light wasn't on this floor. I could feel it, pulling me upward like an invisible thread, drawing me to the second floor. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step an accusation. When I reached the top, I froze. The light was there, spilling out from the crack under a door at the end of the hall. It wasn't golden like I'd seen from the outside. It was sharper, colder, a pale white that seemed to pulse faintly. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but my feet carried me forward. The door wasn't locked. It swung open at the slightest touch, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed. It was vast, far too large to fit inside the house. The walls were made of black stone, veined with threads of glowing silver that pulsed in time with the light. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a box. It was small, unadorned, made of some dark wood that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I approached the box cautiously. The air around it was charged, humming faintly, like the pause before a thunderclap. My hands trembled as I reached for it, but the moment my fingers touched the wood, the room shifted. The walls dissolved, replaced by a swirling void of stars and color. I was no longer standing but floating, the box still in my hands. A voice echoed through the void, deep and resonant, speaking in a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. Images flashed in my mind. Cities rising and falling, galaxies spinning into existence, creatures of impossible shapes and sizes moving through vast, alien landscapes. The voice stopped, and the void coalesced into a single point of light. The box grew warm in my hands, and I realized, with a jolt of clarity, that it was waiting. For me. For a choice. Inside the box was a single key, intricate and delicate, its surface covered in shifting patterns that seemed to ripple like water. I didn't know what it unlocked, but I knew with absolute certainty that if I took it, nothing would ever be the same. I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The void pulsed, insistent, and the voice spoke again. One word this time, clear and undeniable. Choose. I took the key. The void collapsed, and I was back in the house. The box still in my hands, now empty. But the air was different, charged with a sense of anticipation. The house groaned around me, the walls trembling as if alive. I ran. The box clutched tightly to my chest and didn't stop until I was outside. My friends were gone, the street eerily silent. I looked down at the box, at the swirling patterns still faintly visible on its surface, and knew I had done something irreversible. The light didn't return to Fleet Street after that night, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the hum. It's faint, barely audible, but it's there, a reminder that the key is waiting. Somewhere, a door has opened, and it's only a matter of time before I have to walk through. The secret wasn't supposed to exist, not even in whispers, not even in the quietest corners of anyone's mind. That's what my grandmother said when she told me about it, in her dimly lit kitchen, her trembling hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never drank. "Don't let it out," she warned, her voice a rasp like old paper tearing. "If it gets out, it grows legs, and once it has legs, you'll never catch it again." I didn't think much of it at the time. It sounded like one of her fables, something to keep me entertained while I stirred the pot of soup she claimed needed constant attention or it'll rebel. But now, sitting here with my heart hammering in my chest and my phone buzzing incessantly on the table, I wish I'd taken her more seriously. It started last weekend, during our monthly cousins poker night. It's not really poker and barely night, just a mismatched collection of cousins and second cousins who come together to drink beer, eat too many chips, and fake their way through Texas Hold'em. It's not glamorous, but it's tradition. We were 3 hands in, and I just folded a terrible pair of 2s when Luke started talking about family gossip. Luke always starts it. He's like a magnet for other people's secrets, and he wears them on his sleeve like merit badges. Divorce rumors about Uncle Pat? Check. The time Aunt Sarah tried Botox and couldn't move her eyebrows for a month? Double check. The rest of us acted like we didn't want to hear it, but of course we did. Luke has a gift for making everything sound scandalous, even if it's not. "What about Aunt Ruth?" he asked, leaning back in his chair with that smug grin of his. "I hear she's been acting different." "Different how?" Lila asked, nibbling on a pretzel. She was half paying attention, more focused on rearranging her chips into neat stacks. Luke shrugged dramatically, like he was holding back some earth-shattering revelation. "I don't know. I just heard some things. Weird things. Secrets." I knew exactly what he was fishing for. Aunt Ruth, our enigmatic matriarch, had been at the center of a family mystery for as long as I could remember. People loved to speculate about her past. The years she spent abroad, the cryptic letters she sometimes received with no return address, the tiny scars on her wrists that she never explained. She was the kind of person who could make you feel like she was your best friend one moment and a complete stranger the next. And she liked it that way. So when Luke turned his grin toward me, I knew I should have shut him down. I should have laughed it off, made some joke about how Aunt Ruth was probably just hiding her lottery winnings, or a secret recipe for the best apple pie on earth. But instead, I leaned in. "You mean the letters?" I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them, because I know what they're about. The table went silent. Even Lila stopped stacking her chips. Luke's grin widened like a wolf catching scent of prey. "Do you now?" he drawled. "What's the scoop, genius?" I hesitated. The warning bells in my head were faint but persistent, like a distant fire alarm. "It's nothing huge," I said, already regretting my words. "Just some old connections she had, from her time in Europe." "Connections?" Luke pounced on the word like a cat with a string. What kind of connections? Like, mafia connections? Spy connections? Are we related to a Bond villain? Don't be ridiculous, I said, laughing nervously. It's not that dramatic. Just someone she used to know. Someone important. That's all. It was vague enough to be harmless, I thought. Just a breadcrumb to satisfy Luke's hunger for drama without giving him a full meal. But the thing about Luke is that he doesn't stop at breadcrumbs. He starts pulling on threads until the whole sweater unravels. By the end of the night, everyone was buzzing with theories. Luke's favorite involved a long-lost lover who was now a reclusive billionaire. Lila thought it was more of a political thing, like Aunt Ruth had been part of some underground movement in the 70s. Jordan, the quiet one who only spoke when he had something particularly cutting to say, speculated she was in witness protection. That would explain the scars, he said, as if he were Sherlock Holmes piecing together a case. I didn't tell them they were wrong. In fact, I didn't say much of anything after that. I just let the theories swirl around me, trying to convince myself that it was all harmless fun. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The text started the next day. First, from Lila. Did Ruth ever talk about working for the government? Jordan thinks she was a spy. Then, Luke. I can't stop thinking about what you said last night. Do you think Ruth's in danger? And finally, the one that made my stomach drop. Do you think we should ask Ruth? No, absolutely not. That was the last thing I wanted. Aunt Ruth was a fortress. If she thought I'd even hinted at her secret, she'd probably never speak to me again. But before I could craft a reply, another text came through. This time, from Aunt Ruth herself, we need to talk. Her kitchen felt colder than usual when I arrived that evening. She was sitting at the table, the same cup of tea in her hands, the same expression that made it impossible to tell if she was angry, amused, or something in between. You've been busy, she said, her voice low and even. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding. I didn't mean to. Stop, she said, holding up a hand. Let me make something clear. What you've done is not just careless. It's dangerous. I blinked, startled by the weight of her words. Dangerous? I didn't. You don't know what you're playing with, she interrupted. You think this is a game? A bit of harmless gossip? I felt a flicker of indignation. It's not like I told them everything. I just said. You said enough, she snapped. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Secrets have gravity, you know. They pull people in, whether you want them to or not. And once they're out in the open, they don't belong to you anymore. I wanted to apologize, to explain, to beg her forgiveness. But before I could, she stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the dark. Do you remember what your grandmother used to say? She asked, her voice softer now. About secrets with legs? I nodded, my throat tight. Aunt Ruth turned back to me, her expression unreadable. Well, congratulations, she said. You've given this one legs. Let's just hope it doesn't learn how to run. I left her house that night feeling like I'd broken something I couldn't fix. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably another text from Luke or Lila or Jordan. But I didn't check it. I couldn't. Whatever they wanted, whatever they'd uncovered, I didn't want to know. Because the thing about secrets with legs is that once they start moving, you can't always predict where they'll go, or who they'll trample along the way. I didn't mean for the plan to go viral. It was supposed to be a small, harmless prank, a joke between friends to lighten the mood during one of the most stressful nights of Chloe's life. But like most things I touch, it spun wildly out of control before I could grab the reins. Now, looking back, I'm honestly not sure how everything went so wrong. Chloe is my best friend, the sister I never had. She's also the most anxiety-ridden over-preparer I've ever met. When she told me she'd been nominated for the Rising Innovator Award at the Tech Gala downtown, I could practically hear the panic brewing in her voice. She was going up against CEOs and developers who'd patented software before graduating college. Chloe's creation? A device that syncs plants with smart homes, letting your Monstera send you passive-aggressive texts when you forget to water it. It's brilliant, don't get me wrong, but the gala was filled with people who'd probably built robots to replace their childhood pets. She was convinced she didn't belong. I disagreed. The week before the gala, Chloe called me nightly, rehearsing her acceptance speech even though she swore she wouldn't win. "It's pointless," she'd say. "Why would they pick me when Gregory Klein has that AI drone that folds laundry?" I told her she had it in the bag, but she didn't believe me. By the night of the event, she was so keyed up she wouldn't even let me tag along for moral support. "I'll be fine," she insisted. "I just need to get through it without vomiting on anyone important." Chloe's self-doubt was an old foe of mine. I'd made it my life's mission to fight it, usually with humor. She called me her chaos translator because I always found ways to spin her anxiety into something manageable, or at least funny. So, when I found out that the gala was being live-streamed on the Foundation's website, I couldn't resist tuning in and plotting a little surprise. My goal was simple: to cheer Chloe up, to remind her that she wasn't alone in that room full of tech elites who probably coded their emotions into binary. When Chloe's name was announced as the winner, I almost spilled my beer in excitement. She looked stunned, like someone had just asked her to solve a quadratic equation on live television. Her walk to the stage was hesitant, her head ducked slightly, as if she were apologizing for existing. I hated that. Chloe deserved to be up there, to feel like the badass innovator she was. That's when I decided to act. While Chloe stammered through her acceptance speech, thanking her team, her family, and even her houseplants, I opened Twitter. I fired off a tweet to the Foundation's livestream hashtag, "My friend Chloe just won, and I'm so proud of her." Fun fact, her plant device also plays fart noises when overwatered. Hashtag TechGala 2024. I chuckled to myself, imagining Chloe's face when she saw it later. It was dumb, sure, but harmless. I figured it'd get a couple of likes from people scrolling through the gala thread, and then disappear into the void of the internet. I underestimated the internet. Within minutes, the tweet started gaining traction. First, a handful of retweets, then dozens, then hundreds. Someone screenshot my tweet and tagged a popular tech influencer who replied with a laughing emoji and a snarky comment about disruptive innovation. By the time Chloe was off stage, my phone was vibrating nonstop. A parody account created a fake commercial for Chloe's flatulent ferns. Memes started popping up, each more ridiculous than the last. A video clip of Chloe's speech, edited to include fart sound effects every time she paused, was already trending. I didn't realize the scale of the disaster until Chloe called me. "What did you do?" she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I could hear the chaos in the background, the buzz of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and someone poorly attempting to stifle laughter. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to sound innocent, though guilt was already creeping up my spine. "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "Everyone here thinks my device makes fart noises now. People keep coming up to me and asking how it works. Someone literally just said, 'Congrats on redefining silent, but deadly.' I'm dying, Jess. Dying." I tried to explain that it was a joke, that I didn't think anyone would take it seriously. But Chloe wasn't laughing. "Do you know how hard I worked to get here? To be taken seriously?" she said, her voice cracking. "And now the only thing anyone will remember about me is this stupid fart thing you made up. Why would you do this?" I didn't have an answer. At least, not one that would make her feel better. Chloe hung up before I could apologize. I spent the rest of the night refreshing Twitter, watching as the joke spiraled further out of control. News outlets picked up the story, labeling Chloe as the quirky inventor who brought humor to the tech world. A late-night talk show host made a bit about it, complete with a fake interview where he pretended to be one of Chloe's plants. It was everywhere, and no amount of backtracking could stop it. The next day, Chloe texted me a single sentence. "You ruined the most important night of my life." I wanted to argue, to tell her it wasn't that bad, but deep down, I knew she was right. She'd spent years building something incredible, something meaningful, and I'd reduced it to a joke. Worse, I'd made the joke for me, not for her. It wasn't about cheering her up. It was about making myself feel clever. I haven't heard from Chloe since. The memes are still circulating, and people are now demanding an actual farting plant device. Someone on Etsy is selling DIY kits, and they're apparently selling like hotcakes. Part of me thinks Chloe's invention is more famous than it would have been otherwise, but I doubt that's any consolation to her. So here I am, writing this out because I don't know what else to do. I thought I was helping. I thought I was being funny, but maybe I was just being selfish. Am I the asshole? The flyer appeared on our kitchen counter one morning, a bright, glossy invitation promising an evening of immersive culinary exploration. I glanced at it briefly while pouring my coffee. It was one of those pretentious foodie events where strangers sit together at a long communal table, eating bite-sized portions of things like foraged nettles with smoked air, and pretending they're having epiphanies about life. I tossed it aside and went about my day, thinking nothing of it. By dinner, it was taped to the fridge. "What's this?" I asked as I leaned in to read the fine print. "It's an experience," Marla said, her voice carrying the kind of reverence you'd expect for, I don't know, a trip to the Louvre. "It's $100 a plate," I replied, not bothering to hide my incredulity. "For that much, we could get a whole week of groceries." Marla's eyes narrowed. "Groceries aren't an experience, Liam. This is about artistry, atmosphere, connection. Look, it's hosted by a chef who studied in France." I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms. "You know what else is an atmosphere? Our living room. And you know what's a connection? Takeout pizza on the couch. And the guy at Domino's probably studied something too." Marla rolled her eyes and turned back to her laptop. "You don't get it. This isn't just about eating. It's about elevating the ordinary." I could have said more, but we've been down this road before. Marla, with her artist's soul and her endless quest to turn life into a montage-worthy series of moments, versus me, the guy who thought practicality was its own kind of poetry. That night, as we brushed our teeth side by side, I decided to make my case. "Look, I get why you're into this. I do. But we have to be realistic. We've been saving for the washer and dryer, remember? I'm tired of hauling our clothes to the laundromat." Marla spit out her toothpaste and wiped her mouth with a towel. "The laundromat isn't going anywhere. But this is one night. One special, unforgettable night. And the washer and dryer would make every day easier," I shot back. "Isn't that worth something?" We went to bed with a careful silence between us, the kind that only happens when neither person wants to admit they're wrong but also doesn't want to escalate. The next morning, the flyer was gone. I assumed that meant Marla had let it go, but I underestimated her. A week later, I came home to find her at the kitchen table, poring over a spreadsheet. She looked up with a triumphant smile. "I've figured it out. We can afford both." I dropped my bag and gave her a skeptical look. "Both? As in the washer and dryer and your avant-garde dinner party?" "Yes," she said, gesturing at the spreadsheet like it was a treasure map. "If we eat out less this month, skip our weekly coffee runs, and, you're not going to like this, cancel the streaming subscription for a bit, we can make it work." "Cancel the streaming subscription? That's sacrilege, Marla." "Sacrifices must be made," she said, grinning. I sighed. "And you're sure this dinner will be worth all that?" Her expression softened. "I don't know, but it feels important to me. Sometimes, Liam, I just want to feel alive. To feel like life is more than chores and budgets and being sensible all the time." Her words lingered with me, like a burr caught in the cuff of a sweater. By the time the dinner rolled around, I grudgingly agreed to go. I wasn't thrilled about the price tag, but I figured if it meant that much to Marla, I could suck it up for one night. The event was held in a dimly lit warehouse that had been transformed into something halfway between an art gallery and a fever dream. Long wooden tables stretched across the space, adorned with minimalist centerpieces, branches, stones, candles. A string quartet played in the corner, and everyone was dressed like they'd just stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. We were seated with 8 strangers, all of whom looked far more comfortable in this setting than I felt. Marla, of course, was in her element, chatting easily with a woman in a flowing scarf about the intersection of food and storytelling. Then the courses began. Each dish was an elaborate mystery, a tiny orb of something gelatinous served on a single leaf, a soup that came with instructions to inhale the aroma before tasting it. At one point, we were given what looked like a small rock and told to crack it open with a miniature hammer, revealing a morsel of smoked fish inside. Everyone else at the table seemed enchanted, murmuring phrases like transformative and unexpected depth of flavor. I spent most of the evening trying to figure out how I'd get full off what amounted to the diet of a woodland sprite. Halfway through, the chef appeared. He wore a linen apron and spoke with the kind of intensity usually reserved for TED Talks. He explained that each dish represented a chapter of a story: birth, growth, decay, renewal. It was all very poetic, but I couldn't stop thinking about how many laundromat quarters this night had cost us. As the evening wore on, though, something strange happened. I began to notice the details, the care in every presentation, the way each flavor unfolded on the tongue like a secret. The string quartet's music swelled during certain courses, as if orchestrating the emotions we were supposed to feel. It was ridiculous, yes, but also kind of beautiful. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate sphere that melted into a pool of liquid chocolate, I found myself leaning forward, caught up in the magic of it all. When we finally left, Marla looped her arm through mine, her eyes sparkling. "So?" she asked. I hesitated, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of being completely right. "It was interesting." "Interesting good or interesting bad?" "Interesting good," I admitted. Marla squeezed my arm. "Thanks for coming. It meant a lot to me." As we drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about what the chef had said about decay and renewal. How sometimes you have to let go of one thing to make room for something else. The next weekend, we went to the appliance store and bought the washer and dryer. As we loaded the boxes into the truck, Marla turned to me and said, "See, we did both. Practicality and magic." I grinned. And all it cost us was a month without Netflix. Sometimes, when I hear the hum of the new dryer or remember the delicate crack of that smoked fish rock, I wonder if I got it backward. Maybe practicality and magic weren't opposites after all. Maybe they were just two sides of the same coin. But still, AITA? The letter arrived on a Thursday, folded neatly into a heavy envelope with no return address. It wasn't mailed, just slipped under my apartment door while I was out picking up groceries. When I opened it, a small card fell into my lap. On it, in precise cursive, were the words, "Saturday, 7 p.m., wear red." It had to be from Morgan. Who else could pull off something this enigmatic? Morgan was my best friend / chaotic life partner, the kind of person who could turn a coffee run into a 6-hour road trip just to find the perfect latte. They had a knack for turning normal days into stories we'd laugh about for years. But this, even for them, it felt different, formal, and a bit unsettling. I flipped the card over, searching for a clue. Nothing, just that sharp, confident handwriting I knew so well. I felt a thrill of anticipation, coupled with a prickle of doubt. I'd been planning something too, though my surprise wasn't cryptic. It was bold and risky and months in the making. I'd rented a small art gallery downtown and filled it with moments of our friendship rendered in paint, photography, and video. My favorite was a mural I'd commissioned, a swirling, surrealist piece that captured the chaos and beauty of our bond. Saturday was supposed to be the big reveal. Now this. By Friday night, I was pacing, unsure what to do. If I told Morgan about my plans, it would ruin the surprise. If I went along with theirs, I'd risk derailing my event. I decided to play it by ear, hoping for a miracle. What were the odds we'd both land on the same date for our surprises? Well, apparently high. When Saturday arrived, I stood in front of my mirror, adjusting a crimson dress that felt equal parts daring and over the top. I kept thinking about the gallery, about the guests arriving in an hour, about how Morgan would feel walking into a space crafted entirely for them. Yet there I was, stepping into a cab to chase their mystery. The driver dropped me off in front of an old theater I hadn't visited in years. Its once vibrant marquee was faded, but tonight it glowed faintly, spelling out 2 words, "Just US." I smiled despite myself. Of course Morgan would rent out an entire theater. They probably bribed the projectionist with rare vinyl records, or some absurd promise to babysit his turtles. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of popcorn. A single usher in a tuxedo waited at the entrance, holding a program that he handed to me with a slight bow. The cover read, "The Story of Us." My heart flipped. I slipped into the dim auditorium, where only a few rows were lit. Morgan sat in the middle, wearing a suit so sharp it could have cut glass. They turned and grinned as I approached. "You made it," they said, standing to pull out my seat. Was I going to miss my own movie? I replied, trying to sound light, though my nerves were jangling. Morgan leaned in close. "This is a one-time showing, you know? You're going to love it." The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. What followed was a meticulously edited montage of our adventures together, from drunken karaoke nights to tear-filled road trips to quiet afternoons spent in bookstores. The footage was raw and intimate, a love letter to our friendship that left me blinking back tears more than once. By the time the credits rolled, I was a mess. Morgan turned to me, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "So," they said, rubbing the back of their neck, "how'd I do?" I opened my mouth to answer but stopped. My phone buzzed in my clutch, a reminder about the gallery event. The reveal was minutes away. "You did," I hesitated, then grabbed their hand. "Amazing, but there's something I need to show you." "Now." Morgan blinked. "What? Where?" No time for questions. "Just come on." I half-dragged them out of the theater and into a cab, rattling off the gallery's address. Morgan, bewildered but intrigued, went along with it. "Are you kidnapping me?" they asked, grinning. "Consider it an art heist," I said. When we arrived at the gallery, the doors were open, soft music spilling into the street. The space was already buzzing with our friends and a few strangers who'd wandered in. As I led Morgan inside, they froze, their eyes widening as they took in the walls. Everywhere they looked, there was us. A collage of photographs captured the goofy, tender, and chaotic moments we'd shared. Another wall featured framed pieces I'd painted myself, messy abstracts that bled with color and emotion. The centerpiece, though, was the mural, a kaleidoscope of memories rendered in surreal imagery, a world of our own making. Morgan didn't speak for a long time. They just stared, their fingers brushing against the edge of a photo or the curve of a painted line. Finally, they turned to me, their eyes glassy. "This," they paused, struggling for words. "This is unbelievable." I laughed, a little choked up myself. "I wanted you to see how I see us, how I see you." Morgan smiled, but there was a flicker of something else in their expression, a touch of guilt. "Okay, I have to ask, did I totally screw up your night?" "No," I said honestly. "You made it better. This is us, right? Chaos and improvisation." They laughed, and it was warm and genuine. The kind of laugh that makes you feel like the world is a little brighter. We spent the rest of the night weaving through the gallery together, surrounded by the people who had shaped our stories. At the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned and we were sitting on the gallery floor eating leftover hors d'oeuvres, Morgan turned to me. "So, who wins?" I grinned, bumping their shoulder. "Wins what?" "The great surprise duel of 2023. I thought about it. The theater, the gallery, the whirlwind of emotions. I think we both do." They raised a toast with a half-eaten canopy. "To us, then. And to being absolute lunatics." "To us," I echoed, laughing. The first time I noticed something was off about my roommate Ethan, I dismissed it. He'd been acting a little strange for weeks, staying up late, mumbling to himself in our shared apartment, pacing the tiny kitchen like a caged animal. But it wasn't until I came home early from work one evening and found him staring intently at a wall that I started to worry. Not just staring, measuring it. He had a tape measure stretched taut, one end anchored at the baseboard, the other in his hand as he squatted down, muttering under his breath. Ethan?" I set my bag on the counter, trying not to startle him. "What are you doing?" He jolted upright, stuffing the tape measure into his pocket like he'd been caught stealing. "Nothing," he said too quickly. "Just measuring for some shelves." Shelves? We didn't need shelves. There wasn't even enough room in that corner for shelves. But I didn't press him. We all had our quirks, and Ethan's, as far as I could tell, were harmless. Until they weren't. It was about a week later when I woke up to the sound of drilling. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Why would anyone be drilling at 2 in the morning? But then I heard the distinct clatter of metal tools, followed by a muffled curse. I stumbled out of bed, still half asleep, and found Ethan in the living room, halfway through cutting a hole in the wall. "What the hell, man?" I shouted, suddenly wide awake. "Are you insane?" He turned to me, sweat glistening on his forehead, his eyes wild. "I have to get to it," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Get to what?" I demanded, gesturing at the gaping hole he'd already carved into the drywall. "Ethan, you're going to get us evicted." But he just shook his head, a manic grin spreading across his face. "You'll see. Just trust me. It's there." "I know it is." I should have called someone right then, a landlord, a therapist, maybe the cops, but instead, I did what I always did when Ethan got weird. I backed off. I told myself he was just stressed or bored or having some kind of quarter-life crisis. And honestly, part of me was morbidly curious. What did he think was behind the wall? The next morning, Ethan was gone. So was the hole. He'd patched it up so perfectly that if I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it had ever been there. When I asked him about it later, he acted like nothing had happened, like the whole thing was a figment of my imagination. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next month, Ethan became obsessed. He started bringing home blueprints, actual blueprints, some of them ancient-looking, others clearly printed from online archives. He pinned them up on the walls like a detective tracking a serial killer, lines and annotations scrawled in red ink. He started muttering phrases like architectural anomaly and hidden voids under his breath. And the drilling came back, always at night, always in a new spot. Finally, I'd had enough. I confronted him in the kitchen one evening, slamming my hand down on the counter to get his attention. "Ethan, you need to stop. Whatever you're doing, it's not normal. You're not sleeping. You're not eating. You're destroying the apartment." He looked up from his coffee mug, his 10th that day, and glared at me like I was the crazy one. "You don't understand," he said. "This building, it's not what it seems." "What does that even mean?" I snapped. "You're looking for ghosts? Hidden treasure? What's the endgame here?" Ethan hesitated, then leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not treasure," he said. "It's a room, a hidden room. It's on the blueprints, but no one's ever seen it. I think they covered it up, walled it off. Why would anyone do that?" I asked, crossing my arms. "I don't know yet," he admitted, his eyes flicking to the corner where the latest hole in progress had been hastily patched. "But I'm going to find out." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Ethan, you need help. Like, professional help. This isn't healthy." But he wasn't listening anymore. He was already pacing again, muttering to himself about angles and measurements. 2 nights later, I came home late to find the apartment empty. Ethan's tools were gone, his blueprints ripped from the walls, leaving tiny pinholes in the plaster. For a moment, I thought he'd finally come to his senses and left. But then I noticed something odd. The carpet in the hallway was bunched up, as if it had been peeled back and hastily replaced. My heart sank. I followed the trail to the far end of the living room, where the air felt colder somehow, heavier. And there, in the corner where Ethan had first measured for shelves, was a hole. Not just a hole, a tunnel. He'd cut clean through the wall, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. "Ethan?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped inside. The walls were bare concrete, the air damp and musty. The passage twisted and turned, narrower and narrower, until I could barely fit through. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it, a faint whisper, echoing from somewhere up ahead. "Ethan?" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. And then, suddenly, I saw it. A door. Not a modern door, but something ancient and weathered. Its wood cracked and splintered. Its iron hinges rusted. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed the surface, the whispers stopped. Behind me, the flashlight flickered and went out. A scream echoed through the darkness. Not mine, but Ethan's. I never saw him again. "Ida?"